My name is Jacqueline, and I will be joined by some other folks within the Technology Transformation Services of the General Service Administration. I am one half of the Accessibility Guild co-lead. Tony is probably somewhere on the call too. Just to do some housekeeping, we will put folks on mute to cut down on background noise, and some folks have talked about video delays, so if you're experiencing that, we recommend putting your video on mute, and if you want to proactively put your video on mute, feel free to do so. A tip is that video is on for other smaller meetings. This really helps make them feel more active and friendly, but for this one, if we want to cut down on delays, please close your videos. And we'll take questions at the end, and we'll do our best to get through them, but there are just a ton of folks joining today, so we might not be able to get through all the questions. And I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to say more.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I want to echo your thanks to everybody for coming during this super weird and difficult and busy time. I want to thank Ryan for doing this presentation as well, and to the Accessibility Guild for, together with Ryan, coming up with the idea for this presentation. I'll say a little bit about Content Guild. It's for folks from whatever discipline who are interested in content issues. I'm delighted to have the Content Guild and Accessibility Guild come together to do this, because good, accessible, structured content is better content. And with that, I will pass it over to Ryan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is going to be a little bit of a trial as we all lean a little bit more on technology here. So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully we don't have any interruptions here. Thank you for coming. I am going to do a little configuration real quick, and then we'll get going. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. All right, so today we're going to talk about writing for the accessible web. And we're essentially going to be talking about some principles that we can all employ in everyday work as we write for digital media, as we all do. I'm Ryan Johnson. I'm a content strategist at 18F, and I'm in the Portland, Oregon area. So we're here to ask questions like, is this accessible? We use emojis every day. They're inherently visual in some ways, but they are most of the time accessible. You want to think about how many you use in a row, for example, and the descriptions that might be read aloud to somebody who is blind or visually impaired. And just be thinking about when and how you use content. And there's a link at the bottom, which hopefully will go into the chat here. So this is part of a workshop that I developed while I was working in local government, and later at the Department of the Interior, which is where this I'm a nerd comes from. I had worked on a natural resources revenue data website there, an open data site. The full workshop covers user-centered content design, voice and tone, plain language, and accessibility. But today, we're going to focus primarily on accessibility and on accessible content design. And essentially because a lot of training and tutorials and instruction in accessibility for the web is often kind of programming based or developer based, which is important, of course. But today I wanted to focus on how we can all think about accessibility more as we design content for any kind of digital communication that we're working on. I sort of wanted to open the discussion with this quote from Gov UK, the government digital service in the UK. And their head of accessibility said, improving the quality of all the written content on Gov UK has made more of a difference than anything else they did. It's changed the perception of how government talks to its citizens, which is a really, really powerful sentiment, considering that the government digital service in the UK consolidated thousands of websites into a single government platform, and did all sorts of work related to design, visual design, and content structure and whatnot. But I wanted to have this quote here because accessibility considerations and writing content go far beyond. It has a lot of power in your agency to not just make your content accessible to everyone, but to change the way in which the audience for that content views your agency and government in general. So as I alluded to, accessibility considerations go far beyond writing, and we'll get into some of those later. And also, if we have time at the end of this slide deck, I'm going to try to, again, relying if technology it cooperates, I'm going to try to actually demonstrate the use of a screen reader and how it interacts with content. So of course, we want everyone to benefit from the information that we provide in government, and appropriately, we are required by law to make our web content accessible to everyone, our digital content accessible to everyone. But accessibility standards benefit all users, almost all the time, because screen readers and search engines share a lot of characteristics in the way that they parse content. Oftentimes, if your content is accessible, it also improves your SEO, the searchability of it and discoverability of your content. Definitely improves content structure, and we'll get into that a lot later. And also it makes you think about the purpose of your content. Like, why is this piece of content here? And I'll elaborate on that a little bit more too. So here's Gandalf. Using this as an example, this image, how would you describe that image to somebody who can't see it? And the way I like to think about it is, how would you describe the image to someone over the phone? Side note, the full workshop has a lot of Lord of the Rings elements to it, which is why we just saw Gandalf. Alternative text, or alt text, which many of you might be familiar with, is used by screen readers to communicate what's in an image, it describes what the image is. Without it, images are inaccessible to people who are blind or visually impaired. Even in Google Slides, you can, you can right-click on an image and you can add alt text to it. So here we have a description: Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, staff in hand, pointy hat, and long gray beard, walks through the Green Shire, home of Bilbo and Frodo Baggins. Alt text is a great example of how accessible content design benefits all users. Because when you write alt text, you often find the meaning and purpose of the image. It can help you answer the question, does this image convey meaning, or is it just here for decoration? And that can help you answer the question, should it be here at all? Is it a distraction? Is it decorative? Or is it actually providing value to people who are looking at this content or interacting with the content? So this presentation is about writing for the web, but it's also about writing for any digital media, including email, which we do every day. So let's look at an example. This particular email was created in an image app, like a graphic design application. All of the text in this particular email was created in an image generating application and then exported, which means that this text is not machine readable. And presumably, the author of this email wanted to use this sort of graphic motif at the top and just designed the whole thing in a graphic design application and exported it. I'm not convinced that particular email is accessible to anyone, but if you actually inspect it in the code, you find that it has an alt attribute, but the alt attribute is image.png. And that, unfortunately, does not contain any of the text of the email. So all of the text in that email is inaccessible. Screen readers cannot interact with it. Since the text of the email is in an image, the text isn't accessible to screen readers. There's no alternative text, or rather, the alternative text appears to be auto-generated and is just the name of the file. A good general rule about assessing whether or not your text is accessible to a screen reader, if you can select the text and like copy and paste it into another document, then it usually is accessible. If you can't select, copy and paste it into another document, it likely is not accessible and will require additional work to make it accessible. Content structure, the way that you structure your content, has major implications for accessibility. So here's some sample content that is basically about a development project, and it's 4 uninterrupted, unstructured paragraphs. This was my edit of that content, which probably isn't perfect, but basically like structures the content into sections with headings and subheadings. And you could probably tell just visually, this is already easier for everyone to interact with. But it also importantly is structured into headings and subheadings. So we have an H1, which is the title of the page, heading 1. And then in the HTML markup, heading 2 for location, heading 2 for who qualifies, and so on. Headings aren't just bigger, they're semantic. They provide meaning about the content itself. They communicate the relative meaning and importance of the content. So subheadings, for example, are descriptors that are sort of children content to a heading 1, if that makes sense. They basically create the relationships of your content on the page. They also enable the screen reader to scan the page, much like we do when we are reading visually. So if we go back to our uninterrupted paragraph content here, what if I just wanted to know the location? And this is where it's important to think about accessibility when you're designing content, because if you have uninterrupted paragraphs like this, in order to get to the content that you want, it could be in the 3rd paragraph. You'd have to read basically every single word, have the screen reader read every single word aloud until it arrives at the content that you're interested in. So if you just wanted to know the location, then your headings allows the screen reader to skip to different portions of the content, much like we do when we're scanning content visually. It's important also to use descriptive links. So avoid click here and read more links. You all may have heard this before, but basically, if somebody is using a screen reader, it's often convenient and effective to just scan the links on a page by skipping to the links and having just the links read aloud. Someone using a screen reader in that scenario of click here links could end up hearing something like this: click here, link, click here, link, and so on, with no surrounding context for where that link is going to go. So use descriptive links instead, and here are some examples. So instead of click here for a review of this week's board activity, you could write something like view a complete board recap from this week, where complete board recap would be the link text, and it would give some idea as to the destination of that interaction. Or, oh, it skipped ahead. Our new video shows how small grants are making a big difference. Click here to watch. You might rewrite that as small grants are making a big difference. Watch the small grants video to see how, where small grants video is the link text. And that would enable somebody who's using a screen reader to have the small grants video read aloud, and they would have some idea about where that link is going to go. In your web content or your email content, it's typically best not list out URL addresses. This happens a lot when somebody creates a document meant for print, for example, where you do need to, it's not interactive, so you often do need to list out a URL address, and then they just copy and paste the content of that into their web content management system or something. Unfortunately, if you list out a whole URL, often screeners will read out the URL one character at a time. So say something like link, http://www. and so on, which isn't a great user experience for anyone. So embed the link in descriptive text. So for example, your link text could be more low-cost dental care options. So a visual note about links as we get into a little bit of visual design and content design here. Interactive elements, such as links, should have more than one visual indicator. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate why. Theoretically, a street light could be designed to be a single light that changes color. This is technologically possible. It would potentially save money, and only one color of light is present at any given time. It's either yellow or green or red. The problem is if you're colorblind, that would be potentially dangerous for everyone. If you cannot distinguish the different colors, then the streetlight is effectively worthless to you. So that's why traffic lights are designed to have two visual indicators, color and position. Right, so red on top, yellow in the middle, green on the bottom. And this way, if you're colorblind, at least the relative illumination of the position of the light would indicate what status it is. So for this reason, links should always have two visual indicators. Typically it's color and underline, and that is the default. And about 8% of males and 0.6% of females are red-green colorblind in some way or another, whether it is one color, color combination, or another mutation from a recent study. That's over 13 million people in the United States with some form of color blindness. And as government employees, we work for them too. Color contrast is important for similar reasons. So when you're designing your content, you want to make sure that you have a contrast ratio that enables readability. So for example, these two colors, we have a foreground color and a background color that yields a contrast ratio of 2.53 to 1, which means it fails for normal text and large text according to the Web Content Accessibility Guideline standards. And your agency may have adopted a AA standard. Some agencies go for a AAA standard, which is a higher level of accessibility. So in this particular contrast checker, you can toggle the relative darkness or lightness of the color, and it will then allow you to yield to see if it passes at normal text size and large text size at a 7:1 ratio. This particular ratio passes for both AA and AAA. And thankfully, there are many ways to check contrast out there. This one is from webaim.org. Oh, and let's put another visual indicator on that link. If you use the web design system, the US web design system, these principles are built in. And in fact, if you joined the monthly call yesterday, you would have noticed how much thought and care and craft goes into color contrast in the US web design system. And there are some formulas that allow you to quickly calculate whether or not your contrast will be accessible and your ratio will be sufficient. And I think there's a link to the US web design system in there as well. I like to call this in the category of Ryan as a buzzkill again. And also, by way of warning, there's significant motion on the next slide. So I'm just going to pause for a second in case you want to look away or mute. We've all seen this particular effect where this is parallax, where a foreground and a background move at different rates in relation to each other. Animation, foreground and background moving at different rates in a parallax design, automatic scrolling, other kinds of animation can be very, very difficult and damaging if not used appropriately. And so there's this article from A List Apart, which hopefully this will go in the chat too, but from Valhead, basically it reads, it's no secret that a lot of people consider scroll jacking and parallax effects annoying and overused, but what if motion does more than just annoy you? What if it also makes you ill? Which is a reality for people with visually triggered vestibular disorders. The animation can actually make people ill, and the effects can last longer than their exposure to the animation. And my feeling on this is I think it's safe to say that users of government websites are not here to be entertained by our interfaces. They're at our websites to complete a task, and let making any of them sick or annoyed for no reason other than our creativity on a government website design. A few words on document format. A lot of folks probably know this already, but PDFs generally are not structured to optimize for accessibility. And one of the reasons for that is you can basically generate a PDF from almost anything, so it doesn't have a predictable machine readable structure like a web page does. Scanned documents are not accessible at all without some intervention. We'll come back to that in a second. So some PDFs have selectable text, which many screen readers can access. These are the PDFs that you create from Word document, Excel file, etc. So with a text selectable PDF, we see something like this. So this is an agenda for a board meeting, and one can interact with the text by selecting it and copying and pasting it into another document, for example. A screen reader or search engine sees that interaction or that text, but actually the metaphor would be that it sees something more like this, which is just plain text. Screen readers and search engines are agnostic to all of our colorful design elements usually, and is just parsing the text of the document, which as a content designer is excellent because it makes us focus on the content more and think about the content. With a scanned PDF, we see something like this visually. This is another part of an agenda. And if we try to select the text in this document, Adobe Acrobat or what have you will just draw a blue box over it. You can't actually select any of the text in it because it's basically a picture, a photograph of a piece of paper. There's no actual machine readable text in it. And so a screen reader or a search engine sees this, which is a blank screen. There's no content at all in a scanned document without some kind of text recognition. So scanned PDFs are not accessible without using text recognition software, also called optical character recognition, which is often imperfect and usually requires some level of human intervention to fix problems with the text recognition, depending on the quality of the document, the source document. So with Galadriel here, this marks our pivot over to actually demonstrating some of these concepts in a screen reader. But before I do that, are there any questions in the chat that I could address at this juncture?
Yeah, one that came up about PDF was what about spelling out URLs in PDFs that will be printed and posted on a website? One, Ryan, you can jump into, but like if you are explaining that a website exists, like go to healthcare.gov, you should definitely, like, it's totally okay to spell out that URL. And PDFs, if posted on the web or accessed via web, can also be interactive, so clickable and made links. And Ryan, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so I mean, healthcare.gov would be a different interaction than https:/. So you want to think about all of the syntax elements of what would be read aloud. So yeah, I mean, healthcare.gov would be a different interaction. And if you read out to yourself, or if you use a screen reader like we're about to, then you have a better idea of what that interaction is going to look like and how onerous it would be to interact with that particular content. And yes, PDFs, some PDFs are accessible in the sense that a screen reader can interact with them, but they are not as user-friendly, particularly, well, in general, because they're sort of locked into a particular size ratio, and so they're not as flexible in terms of what screen is looking at them and the proportions and all of that. But also from a screen reader standpoint, there's less predictability in the markup of a PDF document. So it's more difficult for a screen reader to kind of know what sections mean what.
And I think that was it for like that bulk of sections.
All right, great. So we'll, hopefully this works. We're gonna try to use a screen reader now and demonstrate some of these concepts with some government websites. If you work on any of these, I'm sorry, but we're all, accessibility is a constantly evolving discipline as technology evolves, and we're all learning how to make our content more accessible. So I wanted to use government websites because I think it's important that we all think about you know, optimizing our content. And government websites usually have different considerations than some like private sector websites, et cetera. I am using a screen reader that, for this demo, that wouldn't likely be used by somebody who actually uses a screen reader every day and relies on it. I'm using a Chromebox extension for Chrome, and it's a screen reader just for Chrome, and I'm using it because it doesn't depend on a particular operating system to use. So Mac has like VoiceOver, which you can use on Apple devices. Windows has theirs, but like and then sort of a screen reader that would actually, like most people that use screen readers would use, would be like JAWS, which costs money. So I'm going to use Chromebox because presumably it is accessible to people who are using Mac or Windows or what have you. But that it's mostly for demonstration purposes and not actually for using a screen reader every day. So I'm going to turn it on, and hopefully you'll hear the screen reader.
Chromebox spoken feedback is ready.
Did you hear that? And is the volume okay?
Yes, and yes.
Yep.
Excellent.
Human Resources. Bureau of Reclamation. Tab.
Okay, so it just read out the title of this particular page, which usually lives in the metadata and the markup. So I'm going to start kind of tabbing through this interface, and and then I'll describe what's happening.
Skip to primary navigation. Internal link list item.
So this is interesting, and this is a really good practice. This site has some visually hidden links that you don't see, but are there and are available to a screen reader. And this one allows a user to skip past some of the other navigation on the site and go directly to the primary navigation, which is great, because if you were visiting multiple pages on a single website, you don't want to have the same navigation read aloud on every single page.
Skip to main content. Internal link list item.
So very similar. This is a visually hidden link that is available to a screen reader to skip down to the main content and bypass all navigation that is in sort of the header elements. So I'm actually going to use that one by hitting enter.
Human resources. Heading 1 main.
Okay, so this is in the main element. The site markup is such that it's coded to basically make available to screen reader. Like, this is the main content area, which allows the screen reader to skip down to main content and bypass all that navigation at the top. So let's continue on.
List with 3 items. Reclamation. Visited link list item.
Okay, so it's giving me some sense of how many links there are and whether or not I've interacted with them before.
Human resources. Link list item. Current job openings. Visited link list
Okay.
item.
So I'm using tab, which is only navigating to links right now. So I'm going to continue on.
Navigation list with 6 items. Employment opportunity. Link list item. Current job openings. Visited link list item. Benefits. Link list item. Job descriptions. Link list item. How to apply. Link list item. Contact us. Link list
Okay.
item.
So all of those are read aloud, and it describes where they're going to go, and generally that's really good practice. Let's continue on.
Exited navigation list with 6 items. Click here. Link.
Okay, so here we encounter our first click here link. It told us we were exiting this page level navigation, but then when it went to the next link in the markup structure, it encountered click here. So let's go to the next one.
Click here.
Okay,
Link.
so we again encounter a link that if just read aloud, we don't have any idea what would happen if we interact with that, and we would need to use a different technique to back out of that with the screen reader to figure out what the context is for it.
Click here. Link. Questions and comments.
Okay,
Link.
so that one's more descriptive. We know what that one might end up going to. I'm going to shift tab and go back.
Click here.
So if I encountered
Link.
a click here link using a screen reader, I would then have to use a different method to go back and read out this surrounding content.
If you are seeking employment and have never worked for the federal government, please click here.
Okay.
Link.
Dot. So keep this in mind when you're designing content, that if a screen reader is going to rely on the surrounding context, then it's going to require more interaction and more time from the person using the screen reader to interact with your content. Let's look at another example.
Incident investigations.
Oops. Go back.
Home, Bureau of Incident Investigations, Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. Banner. Home.
Okay.
Link.
So I'm going to actually.
Main. Safety and Incident Investigations.
Okay. So I'm going to skip
Heading
down
1.
to this heading 1. So as read aloud, it declares it as a heading 1, which is great. But then if we skip headings, if we're trying to just jump to different headings here, let's try that.
Content info navigation. Popular content.
Okay.
Heading 2.
The focus state is clear down at the bottom in popular content, which means that the next heading that the screen reader encountered is down here in the footer. If we look at this page though, we can see that
Exited
there
content.
is this, what looks to be styled as a visual subheading. It's in all caps. National Investigations Program, and another one down here for training.
Training.
It did not jump to these. Normally, if you were going to the next heading, it would jump to them. And if we inspect this with our web inspector, we can see why.
Elements panel.
So instead of being an H2 like we looked at earlier, this is a paragraph tag. And so the screen reader doesn't know that this is supposed to be a heading because it's wrapped in this paragraph tag. Whereas our H1,
Safety and Incident Investigations. Heading
if we
1.
inspect that, we can see it's in this H1 tag, which means that a screen reader could jump to the next heading if we can actually use the inspector to temporarily change this to an H2. You'll see in your content management system that you can select text and make it heading 2. There will be a heading drop down usually, and you can change your heading structure in your content management system. Oops. Let's try this now. Okay, so we've tricked this web page into having an H2. So let's see what happens when we go to the next heading now.
Safety and Incident Investigations. Heading 1.
And 1 second.
Exited main. Main. Safety and Incident Investigations. Heading National Investigations Program.
Okay, so
Heading
now
2.
when we jump to the next heading, we don't jump all the way down into the footer because we've made this temporarily an H2 just in our browser, just locally for me. I can now jump previous heading and next heading.
Safety and Incident Investigations. Heading 1. National Investigations Program.
So
Heading
if I
2.
was interacting with this web page and I was interested in the National Investigations Program, this would allow me to jump to that heading without having to read through all of the text that precedes it. Because the only other way to get there would be to read through everything that comes before it. I'm going to have the screen reader interact with this image real quick.
Investigations photo.
So that is the alt text. And if we inspect this element, we can see that
Elements panel. Tab panel.
our image alt text here is investigations photo, and that's what was read aloud. I don't know that that describes what's in this image, and you want to think about like, what about this, if you couldn't see this, what would be important to convey about this image? I mean, you would probably want to use more descriptive language for this, like an inspector in a hard hat, examining beams or what have you, right? So that the actual content of this image comes across if you can't see it. Let's look at another example.
Environmental focuses. Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement.
Okay.
Tab.
So it reads aloud the title. Let's interact with these images.
Image. Main.
Okay.
Image.
Okay, so we have
Image.
a bigger problem here, which is that these images, alt text,
Elements panel. Tab panel.
is image. So it does not describe anything about what what the content of these images actually is. If we change this to whale tail rising above the ocean,
Whale tail rising above
then we have
the
a more
ocean.
descriptive image with our alt text. Otherwise, these images are just decoration. They don't provide any meaning to a screen reader. And that's where your content design is really important to evaluate whether or not the content should be there in some sense. Because if when you describe these, they don't really have a relationship to the page. I mean, these clearly do in some sense, but it makes you evaluate that content a little more carefully. Let's look at one more example.
Welcome to Gov UK tab. Business and self-employed.
Okay, I'm actually going to
Link.
refresh this real quick.
Welcome to Gov UK. Main section list with 6 items. List item. Business and
Okay.
self-employed.
So it's jumped down
heading
here,
3.
but let's go to previous heading. that will let me do so.
Welcome to Gov UK, the best place to find government services and information simpler, clearer, faster. Search Gov UK, search
All right, I'm
Gov
going to pause it
UK,
for a
search.
second.
Welcome to Gov UK. Heading 1 header.
Okay, so we have a heading 1 header.
Popular on Gov UK.
So now I'm
Heading 2.
navigating to just the headings. So we started with welcome to gov.uk. Heading 1, popular on gov.uk is a heading 2. I'm going to jump to the next heading.
Services and information. Heading 2 section.
Okay, so here we see an example of a visually hidden heading 2 that introduces all of the content underneath it. That visually, when you're looking at it, you can see the relationships between this content. But if you were going through them one by one, you might be confused if it just read benefits and then births, deaths, marriages, and care. So there's a heading 2 only available to a screen reader that introduces this whole section if you can't sort of scan it visually at one time. So then I can tab into that. It's going to go to
Search
the
Gov
search.
UK. Edit text, search entry, search header.
And then
search
button.
List with 5 items.
And then
Coronavirus.
go through all of our menus. But this is interesting too. I mean, there might be scenarios in which you don't need a visual heading element to explain sort of what comes after it, but you would want to explain to a screen reader how everything that it's going to encounter in order after that is related to each other. So this services and information heading is read aloud before you encounter these other links. So I think those are all of my examples. I'm going to turn off the screen reader now and rejoin you.
Extensions tab.
So any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple about the image captions piece that you just showed. When adding alt text, do you need to begin the description of the word image? And someone chimed in that they said no because the screen reader would pick it up.
Yeah, the screen reader will know that it's an image. So you typically never want to include image in your alt text because it will then read image. It'll basically just repeat the fact that it's an image. The screen reader will know that it's encountered an image in that scenario. And you don't generally want to use like photo of thing either, because that'll also be redundant. Yeah, just describe what the image actually is.
Okay, and the other part is kind of like when to use an alt tag or not. So I'll kind of lump these together. Like, is it in a violation of Section 508 to have no alt text image at all? And then in my mind, the image that you showed of the whale page would be considered decorative and should have null alt text. What do you think about both of those issues?
There is a raging debate in the accessibility community about this very thing. I had the opportunity to work with some people at the Department of the Interior who are visually impaired. And I asked them this very question. There were 3 folks there. And they said they prefer to, even with decorative elements, to have them contain alt text to be read aloud. I'm sure other people disagree. These particular folks said that they want to be able to interact with and understand what is there in the same way that somebody that can see it is. So there's a level of sort of the equality in the presentation of content that is important to consider too. Like other people, there is an argument that decorative elements are just a waste of time if they're being read aloud, and it is a barrier to accessing the important content that somebody might want to interact with. I probably shouldn't describe exactly what Section 508 would mandate in this scenario, because I think that's difficult territory to parse exactly. But generally speaking, you should apply alt text to your images whenever possible to make sure that like, but this is a great question too, in the sense that if you're asking if it's just decorative, then should it be there? Is it benefiting a user? And those are exactly the important questions I think that that considering accessibility leads to, and then benefits all users potentially.
Okay. Great nuanced answer. So we had a question. Some applications allow you to enter the title and description for alt text. What's the difference? What should be used for best results with screen readers?
Great question. So the title is a separate attribute, and it will generally, screen readers will read the title. You don't want your description of the image in the title though. You want it, it's expected to be in the alt text. So you could title an image, and I think in a previous slide you may have seen I did add a title that was, try to go back to it here real quick. Doop, doop. So I put in Gandalf the Grey for the title in this particular alt text example, and then the description is the actual alt text. When this generates an HTML markup, where it says description would actually be the alt text attribute, and the title would be a separate attribute, which usually will be read aloud as well.
You said that most people, or some people, wouldn't be using Chromebox as a screen reader. How does it match users' experience with screen readers like JAWS and VDA? If you know.
I don't think many people who from what I know, I don't think many people who actually use screen readers every day would use Chromebox. And in fact, even the Chromebox extension in Chrome, I don't think is being updated by Google anymore. The reason I used it for this is it does demonstrate the fundamental behaviors of a screen reader. And I also wanted to use it in case people who are joining us today want to have an option to test their content with a screen reader. But no, I mean, if you're actually trying to replicate a scenario of like a screen reader that somebody would use every day, then you would want to look into JAWS or something, something like that.
Thank you. How specific should alt text descriptions be, and as compared to captions? And is it best used to specific people, place names, in addition to describing the image's visual features?
Great question. Yeah, this is where I think you need to ask yourself, like, what is the purpose of this image in the context of what I'm creating? And in other words, like, what is the role of the image in communicating with the audience? That'll help you write your alt text. So, I mean, generally speaking, like, in that example we saw earlier, I mean, what is it about the image of the man in the hard hat in the inspection page? Like, what are we trying to, as a content author, like, what would we be trying to convey about that image? You want to think about some kind of fundamental content design principles about, like, right, like, what is the role in terms of meaning for this to be here? What's the voice and tone that we're trying to convey? Generally, the more descriptive, the better, but keep in mind that the text is going to be read aloud. I mean, it can be bypassed at some point if somebody wants to skip through the rest of it, but you don't want super long text. Now, in some scenarios, I've seen this on a lot of government websites, somebody will generate like a chart, like a bar chart in Excel, and then export an image of it. If you do that, keep in mind that the text in that bar chart is probably not available. Like the information in that bar chart is probably not available to a screen reader. And your alt text, you would want to describe what all the numbers are and the general like the general visual characteristics of the bar chart. Like it went up 50% in whatever year and down 30%. Like you would have to put all that into alt text, or else it would not be available to a screen reader unless you were using you know, some other charting library like D3 JavaScript in the D3 library or something like that. But if you have an image of a chart, you'll need to describe it in the alt text, what it means.
I have a tiny thing to add to this. As someone who was on a project some time ago in my time in the private sector where I was doing the alt text for a whole bunch of different articles for our client. And this convinced me that creators of content needed to think very carefully about using these sorts of data visualization things, simply because many of the items that I had to describe were nearly impossible to describe in any sort of succinct way. And I would counsel everyone to avoid putting complicated diagrams into an image that you want to be accessible, which is like all of them.
Yeah, agreed.
Awesome, thank you. We have some other more specific questions, but we have about 5 minutes left, so I can let you keep going. We can try to answer them asynchronously.
I mean, I'm all set. So whatever questions are left, yeah.
We'll keep going then. What happens, or how does a screen reader interpret headings used out of order, like H2, H4, H2, H4?
So great question. It will, so the way I was navigating the headings was just like, go to the next heading. But yeah, I mean, you could also go to like, you want to go from an H1 to H2 or what have you. I think the important thing about that is less about the specifics of the screen reader interaction with like what heading comes next, and more about like the level of the heading will be read aloud, and that will mean something to somebody who's using a screen reader. Like, this is a heading 2, so this belongs in this has a relationship to heading 1, in which it's the next most important thing. But yeah, I mean, like the structure will often be like screen readers can jump from H1 to like the next H2, and if it's out of order, that's a problem. You don't want to do that because yeah, the screen reader could jump around chaotically on the page if the relationships are not such that yeah, the meaningful relationships are preserved in that hierarchy of H1, H2. You always want to go H1, H2, H3, and you don't want to skip back and forth for sure.
Thank you. Hopefully a quick question, and maybe you could even demo like what a pop-up looks like, but on one site you had a window that asked a user to accept cookies. Will a screen reader catch that? And if not, does that pose an issue with disclosure and privacy?
Great question. Great question. I am categorically not a lawyer, so I don't I don't want to go into those aspects of it. It's a great question and a thing to consider, because if you have, for example, a skip to main content link, it could bypass that altogether. So in that scenario, if you wanted to ensure that that part was read aloud, which could get very annoying on multiple pages. I mean, it does anyway, just interacting with, like, a lot of those will take up half of your mobile viewport if you're looking at them on your phone. And they're on every page oftentimes. So you want to think about that. I mean, if you talk to a legal team and they say, we absolutely need people to interact with this, then you would want to put your skip to main content link after it, because you would basically, I guess, want to make sure that the screen reader interacts with that first. To be honest with you, I hadn't thought of that. It's a really, really great question. But yeah, I mean, the scenario would be, don't allow, if you need people to interact with it, don't allow the skip to main content link to be before it.
Someone asked a follow-up question about how much information we can put in that alt text. Like, is there a limit? I've definitely seen some charts that are explained very long, but if you happen to know, Ryan.
I have never encountered a limit in the alt text. I'm gonna have to look that up after this. I have generated a ton of alt text without reaching a limit before, because I have had to add alt text to describe static charts that were generated out of like Illustrator or Sketch or what have you, which is painful. And Jeff alluded to a moment ago, like, you just don't want to do that. But if you have an interim where you have a chart that's an image, a JPEG or a PNG, and hasn't been converted to something that's interactive, you may need to write a significant amount of alt text in the interim before you can rebuild it. Yeah, I've never encountered a limit before, but that's where you want to keep in mind too that, like, the whole thing is potentially going to be read aloud. So what kind of barrier are you presenting if you make it too long? It's a balance that you're gonna, that is challenging to find, but one that will probably lead you to better content if you're thinking through all those things.
A few other comments, but we only have a minute left, so I don't think we have any more time here. But thank you so much for the really great questions, engaging in this talk, Ryan. It was really amazing. I was constantly learning more, and we had like a lot of great feedback in the chat too. Hopefully you can catch up later. Just some housekeeping. It was posted in the channel. Like, DGU always welcomes feedback on this, how things went, so feel free to fill it out. And today's video will be posted on their website next week, and it will be at kind of the same link, so folks can check that out too. I think that's it. And Daniel, if we want to answer some of these questions asynchronously, how could we get back to folks?
If it's okay with you all, I would recommend that with Brian, if they want to email him. Brian, are you open to that? Or Ryan, I'm sorry.
No, no worries. Yeah, I'm definitely open to that.
Okay, I'm going to put your email in the chat window now. All right, there you go.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And yeah, I'll try to get back to you with answers. Thank you.